right, well, welcome to the Southland 30 by 30 Power and Nature Coalition meeting on June 19th, which also happens to be Juneteenth. So I know we're probably a little bit short on our attendance because some people have that day off and some people don't. So appreciate everyone's participation. We do have a presentation to kick things off, and this is the last in our series of presenters that will be giving information to help us navigate our way through 30 by 30 and different methods to acquire land, funding opportunities, and in this case, agency and partnership potentials using the Regional Conservation Authority in Riverside County as one example. So let me give a warm welcome to Erin Gabby, who is the Director of Regional Conservation at Western Riverside County Regional Conservation Authority, and that is the agency specifically responsible for implementing the multi-species habitat conservation plan, which you may hear at some point referred to in MSHCP. We've talked about advanced mitigation before, so this is an example on the ground of one of those agencies that's using mitigation tools. And Erin has a lot of experience, 14 years, leading stakeholder-driven regional habitat conservation plans, which is the federal version of a plan, and then the Natural Community Conservation Plan, which is the state version, and then more recently, the non-regulatory conservation plan, which is called a Regional Conservation Investment Strategy. So we've got HCPs, NCCPs, and RCIS from the RCA. I'm going to see how many letters I can throw out in your introduction. But Erin, you've got a really cool background studying hummingbirds and their pollination systems in the Sierra Nevada. So you did your PhD on that. So you have some extensive experience in conservation that seems to go way back. So welcome.
Thanks. It's great to be here. And I think the original reason that got me here is that a big part of our mission, of course, is conserving habitats in Western Riverside County, but we contribute to the state's efforts in achieving their 30 by 30 goals. And I wasn't aware of this Southland 30 by 30 group. Granted, I've been in Southern California now for about 7 months. I started this position in November of last year. I moved from the Santa Cruz area. So I'm still learning all the stakeholders. So I was able to, I contacted Melanie just to learn more about this, your group, and just thought it would be a great opportunity to provide a high-level introduction of what we are and what we do. And Melanie actually covered a lot of that. So I might talk about things you already know. So I apologize. I'll just try and go through things relatively quickly to give you an idea of how we function, and then hopefully spark ideas in which we can sort of ignite potential collaborations to achieve goals, ideally Western Riverside conservation goals, but really regional Southern California goals, and identify where our organizations and our own interests align, and just trying to leverage the work we all do in Southern California. So let's see, is my presentation going to forward? There we go. So just a little bit of background, and again.
And I don't see slides.
Okay, I should share my screen.
Yes.
Let me get there. How's that?
There we go.
Okay, great. There we go. So yeah, just a little bit about the plan. And so Melanie talked about this already, but the MSHCP is a regulatory plan that was created as part of incidental take permit applications to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and California Department of Fish and Wildlife to impact, or using the regulatory term, take habitat of federal and state listed endangered species. So to get those permits, the application must be accompanied with these long-term habitat conservation plans. So that acronym SOUP includes the federal component, the HCP, and the state component, the Natural Community Conservation Plan. And so that application was submitted in late, approximately 2003. The state and federal permits were issued by the wildlife agencies in June 24. And those permits last for 75 years. So really, that's a 75-year plan. And an important component of that plan is to acquire a reserve system. A lot of that, could say, is made up by mitigation, but there is an additional component in addition to mitigation, which is really provided by the Natural Community Conservation Plan. It's 75 years. However, the plan calls for protection of habitat in perpetuity, forever, and management of land in perpetuity. So I don't want anyone to confuse that 75-year term as an end for the management and long-term conservation. And so the permits are signed by the County of Riverside and the 18 cities in Western Riverside County. We call them permittees, and they, including the RCA, are responsible for implementing the plan. And the plan covers 146 plants and animals, 33 of which are listed as threatened and endangered under the state and federal Endangered Species Act. So at the core of our conservation strategy is the reserve design. I don't know if you can see the title or if there's this header here covering it, the Zoom header, but our reserve design is really to create and expand large contiguous core habitats and connect them across the landscape, and to connect the interior range, the San Bernardino Mountains and the San Jacinto Range, with the Coast Range, the Santa Ana Mountains, and the Cleveland National Forest and BLM land. And this map is a high-level depiction of what our reserve design looks like, with the light green identifying what we call public or quasi-public land, so National Forest, BLM land, and also state and county lands as well that functions as habitat. And then a number of different types of linkages that either connect existing cores or expanded cores that are being created under our reserve system. And as you all probably know, it's important to connect landscapes and habitats to enable movement and dispersal of individuals of all the populations in the area, and provide access to refugia, new habitats in a changing climate. This reserve system is really well highlighted by the needs of mountain lion, which is an important species that we use to inform the design of this plan. There are very few remaining mountain lion in the Santa Ana Mountains, so it's really important genetically and for the population dynamics of the species and the survival of the species in the Coast Range that they're able to mix genetically with the population in the San Bernardino and San Jacinto Mountains. So just a few of the basics of our reserve design. Well, first off, the plan area, what we call the area of focus, is the entirety of Western Riverside County, approximately 1.26 million acres. And ultimately, that reserve system is going to be 500,000 acres in size. So we already have the existing reserves, approximately 347,000 acres of those public and quasi-public lands. And so the focus of the Western Riverside Regional Conservation Authority is to acquire the remaining 153,000 acres to complete that reserve system. So we call them additional reserve lands, and those are going to be acquired or have been acquired from private property owners. So in total, we're about 83% of the way there. We have about 86,000 acres remaining. What guides our acquisition is essentially an overlay of that core and linkage map I just showed you. But we don't have what we call a hardline map. There's no map that says X, Y, and Z parcels are going to be acquired over the long term to create this reserve system. Rather, we have what we call a criteria area, approximately 300,000 acres in size, of which approximately half of which are described in our plan for conservation. And those that half, or 153,000 acres, are the additional reserve lands. And there's a description in our plan for all, and I realized I don't know how many criteria cells in our plan area, but there quite a few of them, 300,000 acres worth, and each is 160 acres in size. And so this is just a more refined map that really guides our reserve acquisition strategy. So again, the existing reserve lands, the public lands in lighter green, and then in darker green are the lands that we have acquired, the RCA has acquired over the last 19, 20 years or so to start building out the reserve system. So approximately 66,000 acres that we've already acquired. And then the blue cells are the criteria cells. So that is where we focus our reserve acquisition. I should go back here, and so you can see, you can sort of overlay the map I showed you before and see that some of these areas are focused on expanding cores, expanding the core protected areas of these public lands, and then also creating linkages across this rapidly developing inland empire. So you can imagine the challenges we face, essentially racing development to acquire the land as development helps contribute to escalating land prices. So it's really putting this reserve system together is like putting a giant jigsaw puzzle together, where each piece is a parcel, a small fragment of land within these criteria cells. And I should also say that this reserve design is informed by the needs, the ecological and conservation needs of the 146 species and their habitats and natural communities that they live in. So acquiring land in Southern California is really expensive, as you all know. So our funding comes from a number of sources: local, state, and federal funding. The local funding is the primary source for funding land acquisition, and it's comprised primarily of development mitigation fees that are charged to land developers and infrastructure agencies for developing land. And a smaller component of the local funding comes from a variety of mitigation sources like landfill tipping fees, various sales tax for transportation uses under our Measure A in Riverside County, fees from developing various public facilities or other special districts that might want to use the incidental take coverage provided by our plans, such as SoCal Edison. So overall, and these are estimates from 2004 that were developed in creation of the plan. 25 years, which is the approximate time frame to acquire those 153,000 acres of reserve lands of $1 billion almost, and over 75 years, approximately $1.5 billion. So the extra I guess you could say approximately $500 million over the second or the last 2/3 of our permit term are really dedicated for plan administration, reserve management, monitoring, and building up an endowment that we are required to fully fund, so that by near the end of the 75 years, there's a self-sustaining fund that will be used to manage the lands, all the additional reserve lands in perpetuity. So a little bit about the Western Riverside Regional Conservation Authority, the RCA. So we're a joint powers agency. So we are governed by a board of directors, which is comprised of the five Riverside County supervisors, as well as one elected official from all of the 18 cities in Western Riverside County. And we're responsible for implementing the Western Riverside plan. So that's no small task. The plan itself is made up of 2 volumes. I think it's considerably over 2,000 pages. So there's a lot of work involved, a lot of details in implementing this plan. And our primary mission is to establish this 500,000 acre reserve to protect and enhance and restore habitats for the covered species, as well as the natural communities that they live in and the native biodiversity that comprises those natural communities. But also because inherently this is an Endangered Species Act incidental take permit, which is necessary to streamline the Endangered Species Act permitting process for the necessary infrastructure for Western Riverside County. So that can range from anything like private development to roads, roadway infrastructure, flood control infrastructure, things that support the growth in the plan area for the next 75 years. The RCA used to be administered by the County of Riverside since the beginning of plan implementation in 2004. But in 2001, it was adopted by the Riverside County Transportation Commission. So we're sort of like, the RCA is like an agency within an agency, the RCTC. So oftentimes you might see the RCA referred to as RCTC RCA, and that's why. Some of those implementation responsibilities really are to collect and expend those local development mitigation fees. The county and the various cities collect the fees, and then we collect it from them, and we need to make sure all the fees are being applied properly and collected properly. So we administer the budget and the revenue for the RCA, and a large portion of our work involves simply just finding and acquiring lands to build out our reserve. It's just a huge, almost overwhelming number of parcels and transactions that we must undertake to complete that 153,000 additional reserve lands for our reserve system. We also manage and monitor those reserve lands. I'll get to that in a minute or two, but we contract other entities out to do that. So we must at least manage their contracts and make sure they are doing the work consistent with the MSHCP. And of course, we also have to coordinate regularly on implementation with the various cities and counties. That's a lot. There are 18 cities plus a county. Those are a lot of permittees to essentially herd in the same direction to make sure that everyone is implementing the MSHCP as the plan intends it to be. And of course, we administer and oversee the implementation of the permits that enable those cities and the county to extend that incidental take authorization to private developers or various infrastructure agencies. So although we're a joint powers agency, we're not a regulatory agency. The RCA is not regulatory. And we have no land use authority. That still remains with the cities and the county. So that's really important, but to remember that we're really here to implement the MSHCP and assist the local permittees, the cities and the county, with their day-to-day implementation of the terms and conditions of our plan. So reserve management, we contract out all of our reserve management to Riverside County Parks. Currently, they're managing about 42,000 acres and have a dedicated staff for reserve management. And really, we couldn't do it without them. And ideally, we would have 3 to 4 times as many staff if possible, especially considering that our reserve system is expanding every quarter. Reserve management, unfortunately, most of our work is dealing with protecting and securing our lands. So our reserve system, a large amount of the reserve system is really within the urban wildland interface and is rapidly being surrounded by development. And so with that, at that interface brings a lot of people, and a lot of people who are going to use the reserve system for its allowed uses, which are passive recreation on existing trails. But of course, a lot like to go beyond what's allowed. And I'd say our most challenging management issues are mountain bikers and motorized vehicle use. They're allowed, mountain bikers, not OHVs, is allowed on existing trails, where designated trails. However, we have a lot of mountain bike use off of designated trails, and we've recently found, for example, in a more remote reserve, kind of near Hemet, San Jacinto, where a handful of people have been creating an entire new mountain bike system and with jumps and everything. And it's really interesting because our county park staff actually monitors local social media just to see, especially mountain bike organizations and that sort of thing. And they found this particular trail system because one of the builders was boasting about it on social media. So, we spend a lot of time and money trying to just block off use of these illegal trails, fencing them, re-fencing them after they're cut, doing that again, putting up signage. Sometimes it's like digging a hole in the sand at the beach. It's constantly refilling. Of course, there's also plenty of other forms of vandalism, graffiti, cutting of fences, gates, dumping of trash. We have less homeless issues than some of the more urban wildlife or reserves, but that's still an issue for us as well. Ideally, we'd be able to spend more time focusing on habitat management to enhance and restore habitat for our covered species. And we do that by developing and implementing habitat management plans for reserve units, essentially within our plan area. So reserve units are areas that are nearby with similar ecosystems and similar habitat management needs. And those really primarily are focused on managing the vegetation, addressing, removing or reducing wildfire fuels, and starting to plan for restoration of previously burned habitat. What's really of concern to us is type conversion. So we don't have a lot of funding to manage for post-fire activities. So that's going to become a more and more important activity that we're going to have to undertake under a larger and larger extent of area on our reserve system. We manage for vegetation primarily by mowing and grazing, and really to a very limited extent controlled burning.
And Aaron, I'm aware of the time. If you
Yeah.
could wrap it up in the next, minute and a half.
Great.
So time for questions.
Yep, we're getting there. So we have a monitoring program as well. Santa Ana Watershed Association implements that, and a large portion of their work is doing surveys for our covered species once annually to every 8 years. So the final two slides I wanted to talk about are to really just touch upon how we prioritize acquisition and how that can inform potential collaborations. So for a number of reasons, a large part of our fee-funded acquisition is driven by the location of development projects. So we don't have much control over that. Our priority acquisitions are more or less funded through grant funds, and those are primarily to expand cores and connect linkages. So this figure just shows, for example, an area in Murrieta, again, the green are areas that we've already protected. And these criteria cells kind of outline what we're trying to protect. So really expanding areas and connecting areas to connect this linkage across 215. So the opportunities that I see for regional partnerships, Southern California partnerships, are one, first, it's important to align regional priorities, identify where various entities' priorities overlap, and focusing on protecting and acquiring habitat. And that can be through donations, collaborative acquisitions, and really collaborative grant proposals, particularly by either assisting writing grant proposals or supporting with matching funds. And then finally, also education and outreach, promoting the work we all do in the region to protect habitats for endangered and threatened species, open space for future generations, for the community, and really increasing awareness to in turn provide more local support and ideally more local funding for the work we do. So with that, wrap it up and happy to take any questions.
Perfect, thank you. I will start with a question, then we'll go to Sharon, but if anyone else has anything, you're welcome to type it into the chat. Dan, I see your hand up. We'll have you go after Sharon, or simply raise your hand and then I will call on you. One question I have was specifically about finding properties that acquisition could apply to one of your criteria cell. How would a partner on the ground, a land trust or another nonprofit focused on conservation, how would they sync up with your efforts to say, I've got this property, it's for sale, the landowner is willing to have it enrolled in this plan? What are good next steps and how do those partnerships align?
That's first step is to contact us. So I realized I didn't put my contact information in a slide. Hopefully it's in the agenda. And Melanie, if you can send it out afterwards, that would be great. But contact the RCA. I think that, obviously the first filter is to look and see if that location, that parcel or parcels is within our criteria cells. And if that's the case, and even if it's not the case, contacting us and that opens the door to a discussion of any sorts of ways to collaborate.
Great, thanks. And yes, I will add your contact information to our meeting minutes. So Sharon, go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
What an amazing presentation.
Oh,
thank you.
Thank you.
I'm kind of curious, going back to the beginning, how did you, or how did they, I guess it was before your time, get a board of supervisors in 18 cities to agree to anything?
Well, Dan could probably expound on that for quite a bit of time, but in my past career as a consultant, I spent most of my time trying to do that. And I think, and that was in Northern California. In this region, I think just the politics make it more challenging. So you really have to focus on the common ground. And this is a plan, these types of plans streamline development of infrastructure and housing. So you have that side that sees government as a problem and the permitting process is a challenge to overcome. And the other side, the conservation side, sees the development as a problem. So it's really how can you merge the two in good long-term planning? And ultimately it's compromise. You have to make compromise. How that's done, a lot of outreach and talking and convincing and compromise.
It must be difficult because at the same time we have the state requiring us to build a certain amount of housing and
Yes,
limited space to do that in.
it's incredibly difficult. It's incredibly difficult. So getting a plan like this finalized and permitted and adopted by so many entities, this is a large, and I think this is one of the most ambitious plans in the country.
Yeah.
It's incredibly ambitious. So you know, the founders, the forefathers and mothers of this plan deserve a huge amount of credit. I mean, it's amazing.
Thank you.
Great, thanks. Dan, go ahead and ask your question, but I would also love for you to comment on the NCCP, HCP working group and some of the work that's going on there.
Sure, I'll make 3 brief comments. As a person who was involved in the stakeholder group at the outset, the question was asked, you know, how did this happen in a conservative place? And the answer is it's a miracle that it happened. It's a long story, but that's the short answer. And just to give you an idea of the political leadership involved, there was this transportation sales tax. Many of you are familiar with those things. And for a local government to obtain its local streets and roads money, it has to participate in the plan. So that's a stick and a carrot. And despite that, we almost didn't get every jurisdiction, but finally we did. And the second point I'd like to make is that this plan assembly is a race against time. There's not 1 inch of this entire planning area that is not zoned for estate lots. So if it's not sprawl, it'll be a 2-acre lot or a 5-acre lot. And this plan can't control that. So it is really a race against time to assemble it. And thirdly, there is an effort to create a Western Riverside National Wildlife Refuge in the southeast part of the plan area in these large core areas. These areas are not very well known to most people. They're fairly isolated, but they're really rich biologically, very beautiful. And if you're on the EHL list, you know, I can, you know, if there's an opportunity, you know, to support the refuge legislation or weigh in on it, I can let you know. So if you're not on my list and you'd like to get, you know, action alerts for that sort of thing, you can put your name in the chat.
And Dan, would you mind commenting on the HCP working group that we participate in?
You mean the advisory committee?
Oh, the statewide group with John and.
Oh, well, sure. I mean, we've got statewide, we have a group of these plans, these NCCP, HCP plans around the state. It's called the Habitat Conservation Planning Coalition. And Melanie and I participate as stakeholders, and we work on both state and federal funding, 30 by 30, and so on.
Perfect. Thanks, Dan. And thanks for your work on Riverside County and many other counties. Andrea, I see your hand is up.
Hi, yes. My name's Andrea Gullo. I'm the executive director of a really small joint powers authority over in the Puente Hills area. And I just wanted to say, you know, it's a great presentation. It was great to hear about this ambitious project. I believe I went to a few of the stakeholder meetings over 20 years ago when I worked for California State Parks over in this area. So it's nice to see how much progress has been made. Aaron, I just wanted to let you know, I was happy to hear that one of your priorities is helping the mountain lions over in the Santa Ana Mountains. As you may be aware of, those are the same mountain lions that populate our area over in the Puente Hills, Chino Hills. And so that's our population. And so if you ever need a letter of support for a grant or anything you're doing to acquire land to strengthen that linkage, the Santa Anas over to the rest of your preserve, just, you know, contact us. We'll support your efforts.
Great. If I had more time, I could spend another 30 minutes talking about our efforts. We call it Bee Canyon right here to connect the Chino Hills and the Cleveland National Forest. So we are, the agenda isn't out, but we have we're looking forward to the Wildlife Conservation Board, fingers crossed nothing happens, to funding, formally funding acquisition or a large chunk of acquisition of property here right adjacent to an undercrossing that Caltrans is enhancing.
Fantastic.
So yeah, we're putting it together. We still have more land now to go.
That's great to hear.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Thanks, Andrea. So one final question before we wrap up. The question in the chat is whether or not the slide deck will be available. Is that something you can
Oh,
email
yeah,
and I can include it with the minutes as a PDF?
of course. I'll send it over.
Perfect, thank you. Well, thank you so much, Erin, for your time today. We'll go ahead and continue on with the rest of our meeting and I'll end the recording here.